I was 12 when my stepmother locked me in the attic for having hair she didn't like. She called it discipline. She called it teaching me obedience. She called it saving me from the nonsense my great-grandmother had filled my head with. What she didn't know was that my great-grandmother had filled that attic with something better than obedience. She had filled it with memory. And memory, I learned, is the one thing you can't lock away. It just waits, in the dark, until someone remembers how to listen. Welcome to Little Bunny Stories. If you're new here, my name is Rowan, and this is the story of how I turned my prison into the most valuable room in the house, and how I learned that the women who came before me didn't just leave things behind, they left me a map. If this channel has ever made you feel less alone, hit subscribe. We tell stories like this every week, and if you're watching because someone tried to lock away who you are, stay until the end. I need you to hear how this ends. Here's my story. My great-grandmother Vivienne raised me until I was 8. She was 9 to 3 when I was born, which meant she had already outlived 2 husbands, 3 children, and most of her friends. But she was not a diminished woman. She was concentrated, all the force of a life lived fully, compressed into a body that moved slowly but never hesitated. She lived in the house her grandmother had built, a Victorian mansion that sat on a hill overlooking a river that had once carried trade ships and now carried kayaks. The house had 20 rooms, 12 fireplaces, and a particular smell of old wood and beeswax that I have never found anywhere else. Vivienne moved through it like a curator, touching doorframes, naming rooms after the women who had slept in them, telling stories that may or may not have been true but felt true in the telling. Every room has a memory, she told me, holding my hand as we climbed the main staircase. Not just the memory of what happened in it. The memory of what the room wanted to happen. The intention, the architecture of feeling. You have to learn to feel it, Rowan. The walls will teach you if you let them. I was 6 when she started teaching me. By 8, I could walk into any room and tell you which woman had slept there, what she had loved, what she had hidden. Not because Vivienne told me, because the room spoke. The wallpaper in the blue room was faded where a dressing table had stood for 50 years. The floorboard in the green room creaked at a specific point, as if remembering a footstep. The attic was different. The attic was loud if you knew how to listen. It was my favorite place. Vivienne called it the ladies' chamber, though no one else used that name. It had been designed as a retreat, a private space, where the women of the house could escape the performance of being seen. Over 2 centuries, it had accumulated the debris of female survival. Trunks of clothes, boxes of letters, furniture that had been replaced downstairs but was too good to discard, and the particular magic of objects that women hide when the world demands they be smaller than they are. Vivienne died when I was 8. She went to sleep in her room, the yellow room where 3 generations of women had slept and didn't wake up. My father Charles found her. He cried, but it was the crying of a man who has lost his housing, not his family. Vivienne had raised him, but she had never approved of him. He was, in her words, a man who needed to be managed. She had managed him for 50 years, and his grief was mostly terror at having to manage himself. He married Penelope 8 months later. She was 32, 15 years younger than him, with the particular beauty of a woman who has decided that her face is her career. She was an interior designer, which in her hands meant the systematic elimination of anything that suggested time had passed. She walked into Vivienne's house and saw not memory but obstacle, not history but renovation project. "Charles," she said, the first time I heard her voice, "this place could be stunning, but it needs to be gutted. All this, clutter, all these old things, we need to start fresh." Charles agreed. He always agreed. He was a man who had been managed by women his entire life, first Vivienne, then his first wife, my mother, who had left when I was 2 and never returned. He didn't know how to disagree with women. He only knew how to find new ones who would make the decisions for him. Penelope started with my room. I had the pink room, which Vivienne had given me because it faced the garden and caught the morning light. Penelope decided it was too juvenile for a 12-year-old. She painted it beige. She replaced my furniture, the 4-poster bed Vivienne had slept in as a child, the writing desk where I had learned to form letters, with white modular pieces from a catalog. "Clean lines," she said. "Modern, you'll thank me when you're older." Then she came for my hair. Vivienne had never cut my hair. It was a tradition, she said, from her own grandmother, who had believed that a woman's hair held her memory, her strength, her connection to the women who came before. "We don't cut it until you choose to," Vivienne told me, brushing it each night with a silver brush that had belonged to her mother. "And when you choose, it will be your choice, not someone else's." My hair reached my waist by the time I was 12. It was heavy, dark, the kind of hair that Penelope looked at with the particular annoyance of a woman who has invested in highlights. "It's time," she said one morning, appearing in my beige room with scissors. "You're too old for this. It's unsanitary, unprofessional. I'll take you to my salon, we'll get a proper cut, and you'll look like a modern girl." I said no. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just said no, the way Vivienne had taught me, calmly, firmly, as if my body was my own and not subject to negotiation. Penelope's face changed. It was the first time I had seen her without her performance smile, and what was underneath was harder, colder, more precise than I had expected. "Your great-grandmother filled your head with nonsense," she said. "Fairy tales about hair and memory and rooms that talk. You're not special, Rowan, you're a child. And children learn obedience or they learn consequences." She took me to the attic, not as a visitor, as a prisoner. She had cleared a corner, moved some trunks, placed a mattress on the floor. "You'll stay here," she said, "until you learn. No school, no books, no nonsense. Just you and your thoughts until you decide to be reasonable." I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I just looked at her and I looked at the attic around me and I thought, she thinks this is punishment. She doesn't know what she's given me. She locked the door. I heard the key turn. Her footsteps descending, my father's voice somewhere below asking where I was. "She's having a timeout," Penelope said. "Learning some discipline." "Don't worry, Charles, it's for her own good." I sat on the mattress. I looked at the door. Then I looked at the room around me, really looked, the way Vivienne had taught me. The attic was not a punishment. It was a library, a museum, a map. I spent 2 years in the attic, not as a prisoner, as an archaeologist. Penelope brought me food twice a day, sliding trays through a gap in the door she had created for that purpose. She never entered. She never looked at me. She would say through the door, "Have you learned yet?" And I would say nothing, and she would leave, interpreting my silence as stubbornness rather than strategy. I was not stubborn. I was busy. The first thing I found was the acoustic system. Vivienne had mentioned it once, casually, as we climbed the stairs. "The women who built this house were clever," she said. "They knew they weren't always invited to conversations, so they built a way to listen." She had pointed to the decorative vents near the ceiling, the ones that looked like architectural detail but were actually channels, connecting the attic to every room below. "Sound travels," she said, "if you know where to listen." I learned where to listen. I pressed my ear to the vent that connected to the dining room, and I heard Penelope tell Charles that I was mentally unstable, that Vivienne had damaged me, that I needed professional help that she would arrange as soon as I was cooperative. I heard Charles agree, his voice vague, distracted, already retreating into the alcohol that would eventually kill him. I pressed my ear to the vent that connected to Penelope's bedroom, and I heard her on the phone with her sister, describing me as that feral child, complaining about my refusal to adapt, planning my treatment. I heard her say, "Once she's broken in, I'll send her to boarding school, out of sight, out of mind." I pressed my ear to the vent that connected to the kitchen, and I heard the housekeeper, Mrs. Pyerly, who had worked for Vivienne for 30 years, arguing with Penelope about my meals. "She's a child," Mrs. Pyerly said. "She needs vegetables, fruit, not just bread and water. She gets what she earns." Penelope replied, "And right now she's earning nothing." Mrs. Pyerly started leaving extra food on my trays. Small things, an apple, a piece of cheese, a note that said "hang on" in her cramped handwriting. She was the only person in the house who saw me, and she saw me silently, through the gap in the door, her eyes meeting mine for a moment before she retreated. But Mrs. Pyerly was not my only ally. The attic was full of them, the women who had lived in this house before me, who had hidden things in walls and floors and furniture, who had left messages for someone who would know how to find them. I found the first diary in a hollowed-out leg of a dressing table. It belonged to Catherine, who had lived in the house in 1847, who had written about her husband's violence, about the attic where she had retreated, about the network of women in the town who had helped her hide, escape, survive. "The walls remember," she wrote. "Even when the world forgets, the walls remember. Leave something for the next woman, she will need it." I found letters in the lining of a trunk, from women who had lived here during the war, hiding soldiers, hiding each other, creating a sanctuary in a house that the world thought was just another mansion. I found recipes, patterns, small rebellions, a dress made from curtains, a meal cooked from scraps, a poem written on the back of a bill of sale. I found a pistol, rusted but loaded, hidden in a wall cavity. I found money, old coins, and newer bills, accumulated over decades by women who had understood that freedom sometimes required resources. And I found the plans. The original architectural drawings, rolled in a tube behind a wardrobe, showing the house as it had been designed, including the attic, labeled Lady's Chamber with annotations in a woman's hand that described the acoustic channels, the hidden compartments, the particular intention of creating a space where women could be both hidden and aware. Penelope thought she had locked me in a storage closet. She had locked me in a survival manual, written by women over 200 years. I didn't escape at 14. I simply walked down the stairs. Penelope had forgotten to lock the door. She was distracted. Charles had been drinking more. The house was deteriorating. Her renovation plans were stalled by historical preservation restrictions she hadn't anticipated. She was losing control of the narrative she had constructed, and in her distraction, she left the key in the lock. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I just walked down the stairs, through the house, and into the basement. There was a storage room there, unused, behind the furnace that Vivienne had shown me once. If you ever need to disappear, she had said, this house will help you. I disappeared. I lived in the basement for 4 years, undetected. Penelope assumed I had run away. She told Charles, the police, anyone who asked that I was troubled and had fled. No one searched the house. No one questioned her. I was a runaway, a problem solved, a loose end tied up. But I was there. I used the acoustic channels to listen, to learn, to wait. I finished my education through correspondence courses, funded by the money I had found in the attic. By jewelry, I sold piece by piece through a network of antique dealers who asked no questions. I built a portfolio, photographs of the attic, of the hidden compartments, of the architectural details that Penelope had dismissed as clutter but which I understood as design. At 18, I left for real. I had a scholarship to a design school, a body of work that was already being noticed in niche circles, and a plan that would take 12 years to mature. I didn't look back, not because I was leaving the house behind, but because I knew I would return. The house was mine. It had always been mine. I just needed to wait until Penelope was desperate enough to sell it, and rich enough buyers existed who would let me buy it back. I became what I had trained to be, a designer of interiors, but not the kind Penelope was, not the elimination of history, but its excavation. I specialized in historic spaces, in restoration with memory, in the particular art of making old houses speak again. My clients were wealthy women who had bought estates and wanted them to feel alive, not museum-like. Women who understood that a house with history was more valuable than a house with marble bathrooms. I was expensive. I was exclusive. I was. By the time I was 30, the designer that magazines mentioned in hushed tones, the one who had a waiting list, the one who turned down more clients than she accepted. And I was waiting. Charles died when I was 29. Not suddenly, slowly, over years of drinking, of isolation, of Penelope's systematic removal of anyone who might have helped him. She had turned the house into a fortress of beige, a place where no one visited, where Charles drank alone in rooms that had once held parties. He died of liver failure, technically, but really he died of loneliness, of being managed into irrelevance by a woman who had never loved him. Penelope inherited the house, but not the money. Charles had been borrowing against the property for years, funding Penelope's lifestyle, her renovations, her attempts to turn a Victorian mansion into something that would appear in contemporary design magazines. The house was in debt, the maintenance was overwhelming, and Penelope, now 47, her beauty fading, her connections thinning, was desperate. She tried to sell. But the house was historically protected. She couldn't demolish it, couldn't subdivide it, couldn't modernize it enough to attract the buyers she wanted. The market for a decaying Victorian mansion was limited, and the offers she received were insulting, predatory, designed to take advantage of her desperation. I made my offer through an investment fund I controlled, one of several I had established with wealthy clients who trusted my vision. The offer was fair, slightly above market, enough to relieve Penelope's immediate debts, not enough to make her suspicious. The fund's representative, a lawyer I had hired for this purpose, emphasized their commitment to historical preservation and restoration integrity. Penelope signed. She never knew my name. She never knew that the fund was mine, that the vision was mine, that the house she was selling was returning to the woman she had tried to erase. I returned 6 months after the sale, not as the owner, as a design consultant hired by the new proprietors to oversee the restoration. Penelope was still living in the house, in a capacity she described as property manager, but which was really just occupancy. She met me at the door, and I saw her search my face for recognition, find none, and settle into the performance of hospitality she had always given strangers. "Rowan," she said, extending her hand, using the name I had provided through my lawyer. "What a lovely name. I'm Penelope. I've been caring for this house well, for many years now." "I know," I said, taking her hand. "I've read about your work, your modernization efforts." She heard the pause, the slight emphasis, but she didn't understand it. She never understood subtlety. She only understood performance, and she launched into hers, the story of her sacrifices, her vision, her unfortunate circumstances that had led to the sale. I let her talk. I walked through the house, touching doorframes, naming rooms in my head, feeling the walls speak as Vivienne had taught me. The beige paint was already fading, already cracking, already revealing the colors underneath. The modern furniture looked temporary, cheap, like props in a play that had closed. I spent a year restoring the house. Each room that Penelope had stripped, I returned to its original state, not as imitation but as evolution. I found the original wallpapers or reproductions made by craftspeople I had tracked down through years of research. I restored the fireplaces, the moldings, the particular architectural details that Penelope had dismissed as clutter. And in each room, I placed something from the attic, a portrait, a letter, a small object that told the story of the woman who had lived there. The blue room got Catherine's diary, displayed in a glass case, open to the page about the walls remembering. The green room got the dress made from curtains, mounted on a mannequin, with a card explaining its history. The yellow room, Vivienne's room, got her silver brush, her photographs, the particular arrangement of objects that made it feel like she had just stepped out. And the attic became the centerpiece. I transformed it into the attic suite, the most expensive room in the house. I kept the trunks, the furniture, the accumulated history, but I arranged it as Vivienne had intended, as a lady's chamber, a retreat, a space of private power. The walls displayed the diaries I had found, framed, illuminated. The acoustic channels became a sound installation, playing recordings of the stories I had collected, not just from this house, but from women across the world who had hidden, survived, escaped. The mirror where I had cut my hair at 14, the night I finally left the attic, the night I chose my own image over Penelope's vision, was mounted on the wall with a plaque. Here, a girl chose her own face. The room cost $2,000 a night. It was booked 6 months in advance. It was featured in design magazines, travel publications, the particular corners of the internet where people seek authentic experience over manufactured luxury. Penelope gave the tours. It was part of her arrangement. She would remain as house administrator, she would greet guests, she would explain the history. She didn't know the full history. She didn't know that the house was mine, that the fund was mine, that every object she pointed to was something she had tried to destroy. She learned slowly. Room by room, object by object, story by story. She learned when guests asked questions she couldn't answer, when they pointed to the portrait of Catherine and asked about the hollow leg story, when they read the plaque on the mirror and asked about the girl who chose her own face. I was always nearby, adjusting a curtain, rearranging a vase, available to answer the questions she couldn't. Catherine hid her diary in a dressing table leg, I would say. She was hiding from her husband. The attic saved her, or the girl who cut her hair. She was locked in the attic for 2 years, by a woman who thought hair was something you could control. Penelope's face would freeze briefly each time. She would search my face again, find nothing, and move on. But the questions accumulated, the stories accumulated. The weight of the house's memory, pressing against her performance, grew heavier each day. The climax was not dramatic. It was a Tuesday afternoon, a tour group of 8 guests, Penelope performing her script in the main hall. I was in the green room, adjusting the dress made from curtains, when I heard a guest ask the question I had been waiting for. "And who is this?" the guest asked. I couldn't see which portrait she pointed to, but I knew. I had placed it there 3 months ago, where Penelope's tour route would eventually reach it. I walked into the hall. Penelope was frozen, staring at the portrait, me at 12. With my uncut hair, my defiant smile, the particular expression of a child who has already decided she will outlast her captor. "That," I said, my voice carrying clearly, "is me. This was my house. This was my room. And this," I turned to Penelope, and this time I let her see it, let her recognize what had been in front of her for a year, "is the woman who locked me in the attic for 2 years. Because my hair was too long and my great-grandmother had taught me things she didn't want me to know." The guests were silent. Penelope's face, her carefully maintained face, her performance face, crumbled, not into tears, into something harder, something that looked finally like the truth. I was trying to help you, she whispered. You were damaged. Vivienne had filled your head with memory, I said. With the knowledge that rooms speak, that walls remember, that women leave things for each other across time. You thought you were locking me away from the world. You were locking me in with every woman who had ever survived this house. And they taught me more than you ever could. She left that night. She packed a bag, called a taxi, and disappeared into the darkness that had once held my prison. I didn't stop her. I didn't need to. The house had already done what I needed it to do. It had made her tell its story, her story, my story, to everyone who entered. It had turned her into a narrator of the very history she had tried to erase. She sent a letter 6 months later from a small apartment in another state. She wanted money. She threatened to tell the truth about me, about the house, about my manipulation. I didn't respond. The truth was already in the walls, in the portraits, in the $2,000 granite room, where guests slept surrounded by the memory of women who had refused to disappear. I live in the attic now, not as a suite, as my home. The hotel operates below me, guests coming and going, the house alive with the particular energy of people who have come to witness something real. But the attic is mine. The diaries, the letters, the silver brush, the mirror with its plaque. My own diaries now, added to the collection. My own letters, my own small rebellions, my own contributions to the archive of female survival. Sometimes, at night, I turn on the acoustic channels. Not to spy, to listen. To hear the guests below, talking, laughing, living in the spaces that Penelope tried to make beige and I returned to color. To hear the particular sound of a house that has learned to speak again. A girl visited last month. 10 years old, the daughter of a guest, curious, brave, the kind of child who climbs stairs she's not supposed to climb. She found me in the attic, reading Catherine's diary, and she sat down without asking, as if she belonged there. Why were you locked up? She asked. I closed the diary. I looked at her, her unbrushed hair, her knees scabbed from climbing, her eyes that saw too much and not enough. Because I had hair that was too long, I said, because I knew things that a woman didn't want me to know. Because this house speaks and I was the only one who was listening. She nodded, serious. I hear things too, she said. My mom says it's imagination. I knelt, bringing myself to her level, the way Vivienne had once knelt for me. It's not imagination, I said, it's memory. And memory always wins. She smiled then, small and real, and I thought about all the women who had left things in these walls for someone who would find them. About Catherine and Vivienne, and all the others whose names I had learned and whose stories I had preserved. About the particular magic of a house that refuses to forget, even when the world demands its silence. I am Rowan. I am 30 years old. I spent 2 years in an attic that a woman thought was a prison, and I learned that prisons are just libraries if you know how to read. I spent 12 years waiting, planning, building the life that would let me return. And I spent the years since proving that the women who came before me were right. The walls remember, the rooms speak, and the girls who listen will always, eventually, be heard. If someone has tried to lock you away, to paint your colors beige, to tell you that your memory is imagination and your imagination is nonsense, I need you to know they are wrong. The walls remember, the rooms speak, and you are not the first woman to survive this. You are just the next one to find what was left for you. See you in the next story.